And at one point in your piece, you're talking about that central banks can continue to sort of pump money into the economy, and you write, to the conventional mind, debt must be eventually repaid through surpluses generated through tax increases or spending cuts. In other words, what and I feel like we're still so in the midst of, like, we're still riding on one of those waves of that tsunami that we can't really assess the damage yet. But what you're suggesting is that what tends to follow these things, and certainly in Europe in 2008, 9, 10, it did more so than in the United States, but still to a certain extent, there was a pivot to it in 2010 in the United States, is austerity. And McConnell's already trying to impose that on the states at this point. If one did not have a conventional mind, what would be the other options? Like, what could we be setting up now so that we would not, or at least building a narrative now so that we would not have to deal with austerity, which was, I think, an unequivocal failure in Europe. I mean, we could still see the social and political implications of it, if not economic, in Europe.
And in the United States as well. And I think you're absolutely right to bring up the issue of the state level politics here, because if you look at the response to the 08-09 crisis in the US, everything the federal government did was largely offset by the tightening at the state level, the city level, where we saw savage cuts in many states for spending on essentials like education. This is really where the crisis of public education in so many of the red states of the United States begins, is in the squeeze that followed 08-09. And folks like McConnell directly complicit in this. And they were complicit also, in the terms of austerity in 2010, because that's not, the Obama administration included a lot of Clinton veterans who were quite hard on the deficit, but they were driven in that direction by just the blanket Stonewall resistance to the GOP in Congress that McConnell was the leader of, right? He said he wanted Obama to be a one-term president. That was his main mission in politics. So absolutely, I think this is really a crucial issue. Is not in the first instance, in the crisis itself, and especially when you've got a Republican president. Then, of course, and it's an election year, then the taps are full on. But if Joe Biden wins in November, expect the entire conservative political machine, along with its media, to pivot on a dime, and from then on in, it'll be deficits and debt as the central issue that's threatening the United States. For people of a different political persuasion, my basic advice is just don't talk about debt. And that's not a counsel of irresponsibility. Don't talk about debt. Debt doesn't have to be an issue. It doesn't have to be an issue for two basic reasons, or three, really. It doesn't have to be an issue for the United States because the United States is the issuer of the dominant currency in the world. Everyone in the world wants dollars and can use dollars. This crisis has only reaffirmed that. America is not going to be subject to the blackmail of foreign creditors. America is not in the position of a household when it borrows. It is the ultimate global sovereign debtor, if you like. So America is not constrained in the way that an Argentina is, for instance. That's the first issue. Secondly, right now, it's incredibly cheap to borrow because interest rates are low. So even if the debt numbers are huge, the interest rate that the Americans pay on this is derisory. So it's really a small price to pay for investments that are essential right now to sustain life in the US, get life back to normal, and ideally, of course, begin that process of transformation. Because I like the point you made earlier on, that really this is about transformation, and the question is, what direction does this go in? And the third reason is that once again, we've demonstrated the basic truth in this crisis, as we did in 08-09, which is that public debt is different, because public debt is an asset which is used by everyone for the purposes of long-term investing, for safe investing, and is managed by and has a prime claim on the attention of the Federal Reserve, the central bank. And ultimately, debt which is owed by the federal government but held by the central bank is quite literally debt that we owe to ourselves, money that we owe to ourselves. And to the extent that we owe it to ourselves, it's essentially might as well not be a matter of concern, because it shows up on both sides of our public balance sheet. It shows up as a debit on one side of the federal government, but as a credit on the balance sheet of the central bank. So it's just not something that we need to be concerned about. There is a flip side to that, which is the central bank money issued by the central bank in exchange for the debt that it buys. But that could, under certain circumstances, trigger inflation. But we are a million miles away from a world in which inflation of that type is going to happen. So for all of those reasons, we should just not be worrying about debt. We should really not even be, if we can possibly be, engaging on the terrain of debt politics. Because anyone who raises that at this point is really raising a red herring, and you've got to ask why they're doing that.
Well, they're doing it because they want to. I guess the analogy I've been using in terms of that first stimulus was that, you know, everybody's under the yellow flag except for a narrow set of wealthy elite, and when they get that money, they're zooming around the racetrack, and they want to maintain that dynamic, essentially, and that's where talk of debt comes in. We need the austerity is for everybody else, essentially.
Well, it's for those who are dependent on, you know, quote unquote entitlements, for instance, or at the federal, at the state level, at the local level, the people who are reliant on public schooling or the public infrastructure rather than private schools, and that could afford to look after themselves through those kind of mechanisms. So indeed, yes, the debt is really a kind of albatross that you hang around the neck of the public sector. And I basically suspect anyone of bad faith who even raises the issue. That's what I was trying to get at with this notion of like the conventional mind, which I take to be basically a conservative position that misunderstands the nature of government debt and treats it as analogous to that of a private household, which is basically just a false analogy. It's misleading, and its politics are profoundly conservative.
So in the event that we are in a position where, you know, the only response, I mean, it does feel like on some level that the way that we get to non-austerity policies is to drive up that debt so large that it's just an impossible task to sort of like refill those coffers and just force almost, you know, whoever's in power on the other side of this. I mean, you know, again, to go back to that analogy, the water comes in, at one point it recedes, and then you're just sitting there in the wreckage. We're still in the process of the water, like it hasn't even hit the beach yet on some level. And so we don't even know how far inland it's going to go. But when we get to the other side where we are surveying the wreckage after the water has receded, on some level, it sounds like we need to have so much debt that the only answer is to just look at those, basically those accounting, those spreadsheets, and just go, we're just going to zero balance it across the, you know, on this ledger and that ledger.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk Turkey here. I mean, what the Democrats should not do is submit to the blackmail which they've submitted to twice already, which was that the Reagan deficits were run up as a combination of military spending and tax cuts, were then worked down by the Clinton administration, which submitted to the blackmail of responsibility in fiscal policy and made it its job to cut the deficits. And then the Bush deficits, again, run up due to wars of choice on the one hand and huge tax cuts in the middle of those wars of choice, became the legacy of the Obama administration. And the Obama administration, forced its hand in part by the non-cooperation of the Republicans, made it its job to stabilize the budget again. And so this is a completely one-sided political game in which, as it were, the Democrats are responsible for restoring, quote unquote, the fiscal credibility of the United States, and the Republicans use the capital stored up in that process then to line the nests of their voters who are in favor of both high spending on the one hand, especially on the military, and tax cuts on the other. And no incoming Democratic administration should submit to that blackmail again. And the answer to that is indeed, as you say, simply to call their bluff and to say, look, we can run deficits too. These are our priorities as opposed to your priorities. Our priorities don't include tax cuts for the rich, and they don't include massive military spending. They do include high spending on infrastructure. We would talk about taxes, but we would want to concentrate them progressively on those of higher income and wealth. And we will run whatever deficit is necessary to achieve our objectives of full employment and sustainable transformation of the American economy. And then we'll figure out how we deal with the debt afterwards, right? And anyone who tries to argue from the Republican side at this point about debt, it just needs to have their bluff called, because a look at the track record of the last, not the last 10 years, but the last 40 years, all the way back to the 1980s. So yes, indeed, but this is a message, of course, that has to be driven home to Biden and the team of advisors around Biden, because they are the Democratic hope now. And we know that, broadly speaking, Biden is a completely conventional centrist Democrat, and folks like Larry Summers are amongst those advising him. And they have been part 2 times over of consolidation efforts within the American budget under Democratic administrations. And it would really be a historic tragedy if a Biden administration was to renew that agenda, because it just simply hands the game to the Republicans every time.
I'd be remiss if I also didn't point out that Nancy Pelosi is of that ilk. I mean, she a Pete Peterson acolyte. She was talking about if we take back the House, we're going to install pay-go, which basically means that we cannot deficit spend. I mean, she's.
I mean, Barack Obama himself, would talk about belt tightening.
Yes.
I mean, it's bad economics and it's worse politics, and it's disabling. And it's part historically of the deal that was done between the Clinton team and Rubin from Goldman Sachs in the 1990s. We know exactly what the trap was. We know what its political advantages were. Certain sorts of risks went away. You made peace with Alan Greenspan. You made peace with Wall Street. It was good for the coffers of certain sorts of elite Democrats in terms of campaign funds and so on. It put them in contention to compete head on head with the Republicans in terms of money raising. But in terms of actually progressive politics, especially given the pressures of rising inequality, a real catastrophe for certain segments of American society, it's been devastating for the credibility of the Democrats amongst that kind of electorate.
All right.